Members, we now turn to the health practitioners, replacement of statutory references to medical practitioners bill. And the question is that part 1 stand part. I call Puta Williams.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. Mr Chairman, I rise to take a call on the health practitioners' replacement of statutory references to medical practitioners bill. Mr Chairman, this is a piece of legislation that the Labour Party are supporting. It does make some practical changes that we endorse. And just perhaps, Sir, just to go through some of those changes and what we are supporting. The objectives of this particular piece of legislation is really around the definition of what is a health practitioner, ensuring that there's consistency of those definitions around the regulatory framework that govern health practitioners, and namely the Health Practitioners Competency Act and its framework. And actually it recognises the way that we conduct our health services in the modern age. So we are very supportive of the changes that this piece of legislation recommends. Mr Chairman, there are about 7 pieces of primary legislation that are impacted by the changes to the definition of medical or health practitioners and the types of functions and duties that they will be able to carry out under the auspices of those several pieces of legislation. And I want to talk specifically about the definitions of health practitioners in terms of nurse practitioners and the scope of practice that a nurse practitioner now is able to complete, what is defined within the practicing certificate of that nurse practitioner, how the Nursing Council have been consulted and are engaged in that particular discussion, and what that actually means in terms of the practical service that they are able to deliver. In the legislation, if we look to the separate pieces of legislation that this amendment bill will amend, specifically under the amendments to the Burial and Cremation Act 1964, what it looks like is determining who can sign off on a certificate of death and the conditions that sit around that particular practice. And it's an important duty and function that our health practitioners are required to do. So there are some specific conditions under which a health practitioner can sign a certificate of death. The definition of the health practitioner is aligned to that within the Health Practitioners Competence Assurance Act 2003, and it gives some practical examples of the types of scenarios that they will be able to issue a certificate of death under. Under the amendments to the Children, Young Persons and Their Families Act, they make some changes specifically under Section 2 to the psychiatric hospital, which is now just referred to as hospital. And it's been a long time since the practice of, since we actually called mental health tertiary institution psychiatric hospital. So it's very much in line with our modern practices in terms of health. What it also does too is it provides for those health practitioners to conduct examinations of children and young persons as defined within the Children, Young Persons and Their Families Act, specifically around Section 52 and Section 53. Under Part 5, there were amendments to the Land Transport Act, and that is specifically around the ability of health practitioners to conduct a couple of duties, particularly when it comes to the eye checks when you are applying for a driver's licence, and the taking of blood specimens when you are when you've been pulled over by the police in relation to drink driving blitz, for example, and found to potentially be over the limit, and a blood specimen is required of you, Mr. Chair. Also within the amendments in Part 5A to the Medicines Act, it talks specifically about the ability to look at the prescription of drugs, and under the Mental Health Compulsory, Mr. Chairman, Compulsory Assessment and Treatment Act, it looks at the scope of practice with regards to the assessments that one can conduct in terms of relation to your mental well-being, and that's often very important, particularly in times when you won't have access to a psychiatrist or some other medical professional to conduct the mental health assessment. It may be on the weekends, it may be at a time when a person has been picked up by the police due to criminal activity or his behaviour or her behaviour, and requires mental health assessment. And lastly, Mr. Chairman, it talks, the bill makes amendments to the Misuse of Drugs Act, and that's particularly around dealing with controlled drugs. That's around the prescription and the administration of controlled drugs in a range of settings, whether it's in a veterinary setting where you are administering to animals, or whether it is within the setting of a hospital, or even in a community setting such as would be provided by mental health community services. Mr. Chairman, they are sensible and necessary amendments to those pieces of legislation, and the Labour Party will be supporting this piece of legislation.